Okay, so you just finished either reading or listening to the poem Mother to Son by Langston Hughes. So we're going to kind of analyze this poem, or what I like to say is breaking down the poem. So, kind of breaking it into pieces and really looking closely and deeper at some of the meaning. Because poetry, not always, but oftentimes is really short. But even though it's short, it still has a lot in it. So we really want to kind of dissect or pick apart, break down all the pieces here to make sure that we really understand what's being said, because this is a pretty powerful and deep poem. So let's start first with, we're going to be looking at the metaphor of this poem. And let's kind of remind ourselves here for just a second. A metaphor, what a metaphor is. So just take a minute, think, what is a metaphor? We talked about figurative language a couple of times this year, and it's been brought up several times. So if you remember, a metaphor is comparing two things, not using like or as. It's also saying one thing is the other. Move this so we can see it a little bit better. So comparing two things, not using like or as, and it's normally saying like one thing is the other, right? Poetry does this a lot. Poetry uses lots of figurative language, but especially the metaphor. I feel like the metaphor is kind of a staple when it comes to poetry. Poets love using metaphors and comparing one thing to another thing to really get their point across. So, if we're thinking of this poem, Mother to Son, I think one part is really apparent. Um, and I think that's the staircase, right? We know that a staircase is used in this poem a lot. And that's the reference, the metaphor that's being used here. Let's make this a little bit bigger. But what is Langston Hughes comparing to the staircase? This is the trickier part, I feel like. They do mention it, but they focus more on the staircase. Do you know what Langston Hughes is trying to say is like the staircase? If you said life, you are completely correct. Life is what's being compared here. They're saying life is the staircase. If we wanted to change it to a simile, we could say life is like a staircase. But since we're using a metaphor, we're just saying life is a staircase. And in this case, they say it's not a crystal staircase, but just a regular staircase. So let's look at extending this a little bit. First off, extending a metaphor, extended metaphor, in this case, just means that an author, let's spell author right, is introducing a metaphor and then explains it throughout the text. So an extended metaphor means that they pretty much use it for the entire thing, and that's what Langston Hughes did here. He took one metaphor and he just explains it and explains it throughout the entire poem. Most of the poem is meant to explain what the metaphor means. So that's which makes sense. When you extend something, you lengthen it or you add to it, and that's what he's doing here, is he's extending the metaphor. So to really kind of understand that, he breaks it into a couple of pieces. So I want to look at those pieces from the actual text from the poem and really kind of get some meaning out of it and understand exactly what meaning he's trying to pull from this. So let's take a few of them and see what we can come up with. So life for me ain't been no crystal stair. So this is kind of the big piece of the poem. This is what he's trying to get across throughout most of the poem. And I say he, but in the poem, he actually makes it, a mother is talking to her son about this and sharing this information. So life for me ain't been no crystal stair. I think, because poetry is subjective, which means everybody gets their own opinion on it, they get their own take from it, but I think this just means that life is difficult. It's not an easy thing, especially for this person, this mother that's sharing. It's been no crystal stair. When I think of crystal, I think of fancy things, and I'm going to put that, not fancy. It's not been easy. So, life has been difficult. It's not been fancy for this mother that's explaining this to her son. It's had tacks in it. Okay, well, when I think of attack, I think of something sharp that's hurtful. So it's had tacks in it. So maybe there have been things have happened that hurt this mother. So like I said, tacks are sharp, they hurt, and so I'm thinking this is the way the mother is telling her son that, she's had some things that have been hurtful that's happened in her life. Let's see. Splinters and splinters. Okay, well, I'm going to go back to the actual metaphor of the staircase. So, splinters probably aren't as bad as tacks, right? I would probably rather have a splinter in my finger than an entire tack in my finger, right? So splinters. That's probably a little bit less than this. So a splinter would probably be kind of inconvenient. It would hurt, but you could kind of move on from it. So I like inconvenient. Things have been in. I don't know if I spelled inconvenient right there, but that's okay. I don't think I did. That doesn't look right to me. But that's all right. Sometimes, we don't always have things spelled completely correctly, and that's okay. We can kind of move on from that. But things have been inconvenient. So not everything has been right there for them, right? You run into snags. When you hit a splinter, you don't always see it. But sometimes you just kind of stumble upon it, and then it just makes things inconvenient, right? So that's that one. I want you to take a minute. If you need to pause the video, I want you to see if you can figure out what the last two things. So, and boards torn up. I think this one especially could be an opinion thing. What do you think they mean by boards are torn up? How is that connecting to this person's life a little bit? And then don't you set down on the steps. What do you think that mother is trying to tell her son by saying, don't you set down on the steps? So take a minute. If you need to pause the video, pause the video. If you have been writing as I've been talking, that's okay too. But take just a minute and see if you can figure out what those two things mean or what they mean to you. While you do that, I'm going to fix inconvenient. There we go. All right, so if you've paused it and you've come up with your answers, great. If you haven't, that's okay. We're going to keep going on. So my idea of the boards have been torn up. There have been obstacles in her way throughout her life. Because if I was walking up a staircase and there was a board that was torn up, that's going to make it really difficult for me to continue going, right? I'm going to have to skip a step, or I'm going to have to fix it before I move on. So there have been obstacles in her way. Maybe you took that as something else. Maybe you wrote something differently there, and that's okay. Like I said, when it comes to poetry, there's a lot of things that can be subjective, or meaning that we kind of get to have our own interpretation or our own feelings about that. But to me, I think boards torn up mean that there are some obstacles in her way. Don't you set down on the steps. I think this one's a really important one. I think if you set down on the step, that means that you are stopping. You're not continuing to move forward in your life. So I think the mother here is saying, don't stop trying, or don't stop, or keep going. Right? Don't stop trying and keep going. Don't set down on those steps. You keep on working up that flight of stairs. You keep going towards what it is that you want from life. Now, again, you may have thought of something different for don't set down on the steps. That's fine too. There are really kind of no wrong answers here. Okay, let's look at the next page, if I can get to the next page. Okie dokie, so we're going to look at this again. I think it's going to be a good idea. I'm going to go back and actually reread the poem one more time because we've done that whole first page. I just kind of want to remind myself a little bit about the poem here. So I'm going to reread the poem quickly to myself, and then we can go on to the last part. Well, son, I'll tell you, life for me ain't been no crystal stair. It's had tacks in it, and splinters, and boards torn up, and places with no carpet on the floor, bare. But all the time I's been a climbin' on, and reachin' landings, and turning corners, and sometimes goin' in the dark, where there ain't been no light. So, boy, don't you turn your back. Don't you set down on the steps, 'cause you find it's kinder hard. Don't you fall now, For I still going, honey. I still climbing. And life for me ain't been no crystal stair. All right, now that I've read that, now that we've broken down those pieces and parts a little bit, I want to look at the theme. So we've talked about theme a lot this year. So theme just means what's the message? What's a lesson that we could learn from this poem? And I will tell you, theme doesn't have to just be one theme. You can find multiple themes in one text, and I think this is definitely an example of a place where we could find more than one theme. So just because I'm coming up with this theme doesn't mean that it would have been the theme that you would have come up with. But I think for me, I think the theme of this poem is to keep going and not to give up. Keep going and don't give up. I think that that's the message that this mother is trying to convince her son of. And most of the time when we think of theme, we think of theme, we think of something that doesn't necessarily applies to the characters, but applies to our own life. And in this case, I think that the lesson that this mother is trying to teach her son absolutely can apply to our own life, that we need to keep going when things get tough, not to give up on things that we want or things that we need to do. So this is one of those rare examples where the lesson that the character is supposed to learn is also something that we're supposed to learn too. So that's my theme, is that keep going, don't give up, maybe perseverance if we wanted to put it in just one word, to persevere, to keep going, not to give up. So the support, we're going to look back in the poem and see what tells me that this is to keep going and not to give up. Well, if I am looking here where she says, I've been a climbing on. So she's saying, I haven't given up. Even though all these things, even though I've hit these tacks and these splinters and these torn up boards and places that didn't have carpet on the floor, I'm still climbing on. So I'm going to use that direct quote as my evidence. So let me go back. So my first support, and I'm going to put it in quotes because it's directly from the text. So even though life hasn't been easy for her, she's still going. So I think that's one piece of evidence. Let me go back in the text again. Let's see. I think that where she says don't set down on the steps, we just talked about that one, but I think that's another good piece of evidence in here. She's saying don't stop, right? Don't give up. Keep on moving. Don't set down on the steps. I know it would be easy to quit, but don't set down on the steps. You got to keep moving. I think that's another good piece of evidence. And then let's look back, see if we can find one more thing. You know, she says, I've been climbing, and I think she says it again. I'm still climbing. I'm not stopping. You're not stopping. So let's add that for our last piece of evidence. Now, if you came up with a different theme, then you might have different evidence to support it, and that's okay. As long as I can say, yep, this connects with this. I'm still climbing. That says keep going. Don't set down on the steps. That says don't give up. I'm still climbing. I'm still going. You've got to keep going. All of those things match up. They help support our theme of this poem. And the last thing is, what is the message of this poem? We just kind of got that, right? Is that it's this mother, a mother telling her son not to give up and to keep going in life. I'm going to move this back over here. And how that relates to us, we could say the message is to keep going, even when life is difficult. Right? Even though this mother has been been through so much in her life, she's saying, life gets difficult, but you just got to keep pushing. You just got to keep going. The second question says, how does Langston Hughes convey this message in the poem? I think he does a really, really good job, and I think it sounds like something that a mother might share with their child. So I think he uses the mother/son relationship to help. He uses the metaphor of a staircase. I think the metaphor is a big one. Using, the staircase to tell his story and to really get his poem across. He also uses a lot of description of the staircase. And I think that really helps to drive his point home too. Okay, I think we've got it. So if you need to go back and review any parts of this video, you're welcome to do so. This is one of my favorite poems. I'm hoping that you've enjoyed it too. I'm hoping that maybe it's left you a little bit inspired today. We're going to continue working on this week. We're not going to do the exact same thing. We've got 2 more poems that we're going to work on that are a little bit different. But I'm hoping that this went well. Like I said, if you need to go back to earlier in the video to go back over. We're not going to turn this one in today. We're going to turn in the one that we're going to do tomorrow. But you still have a few more things in the module, so go ahead and head on over to the next page.